Another Boston engraver, Henry Pelham, was livid that Revere had in fact copied his print of the event. And this is Pelham's version here. In a letter to Revere dated March 29th, Pelham wrote, quote, "When I heard that you was cutting a plate of the late murder, I thought it impossible, as I knew you was not capable of doing it unless you copied it from mine."
Talk for this evening is given by Nan Wolverton, a PhD, is the Director of Fellowships as well as the Director of CHAVIC, the Center for Historic American Visual Culture at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester. Today, Nan's talk for us is going to be Paul Revere, Isaiah Thomas, and the collection of revolutionary resistance.
When we think of dissent or protest during the Revolutionary era, there is one iconic image that likely comes to mind. Paul Revere's Boston Massacre. In this image, it doesn't matter that the colonists are not actively resisting. They are, of course, portrayed as victims, and as such, it was used as an image to protest British aggression. Prints like this one helped fuel the revolution and remind us of the power of the image as propaganda. As many know, the print was not even designed by Revere, nor does it accurately represent what happened, but it has become synonymous with Revere, and it has been described as the cornerstone of any early American print collection, not because it commemorated one of the major events, not because of its rarity, but because it commemorated one of the major events in American history, because it was engraved by a famous artisan and patriot, and because its crude coloring and design made it appealingly decorative. Prints such as this persist in our cultural memory and serve as touchstones to our national past. For our purposes this evening, I will be focusing on Revere's prints of the Revolutionary period as collected by the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts. Both a learned society and a major independent research library, the AAS holds the largest collection of Revere's engravings. There are, of course, many objects in the Society's collections, and I'll take just a moment here to give you a sense of the institution and its vast collections. The AAS Library houses the largest and most accessible collection of books, pamphlets, broadsides, newspapers, periodicals, sheet music, and graphic arts material printed through the 19th century in what is now the United States, as well as manuscripts and a substantial collection of secondary works, bibliographies, and other reference works related to all aspects of American history and culture before the 20th century. We have over 3 million items housed on 25 miles of shelving. The strength of the collection is in both its breadth and depth. There are 5 floors and 4 separate book stacks, and the AAS is the nation's chief repository for early American newspapers, some 2 million issues that take up 5 miles of shelves. The Society was founded in 1812 by the Revolutionary War patriot and printer Isaiah Thomas, seen here. Thomas began his career as a 6-year-old apprentice to printer Zachariah Fowle of Boston. He was sent there by the overseers of the poor because his mother could not afford to keep him. Fowle was a printer of cheap broadsides, ballads, chapbooks, and educational texts. Thomas learned to read and write while setting type. He worked his way up, moved away, came back, and by 1870 he went into partnership with Fowle and began publication of the Whig newspaper, the Massachusetts Spy, which strongly supported the American cause for independence. Thomas's publication roused Americans throughout the colonies to rebel against British authority and inspired them to seek independence. His printing shop was called the Sedition Foundry, and he was frequently in trouble with the royal government of Massachusetts. Fearing his press would be impounded, Thomas's friends, including John Hancock, Joseph Warren, and Timothy Bigelow, urged him to remove it from Boston for safekeeping inland. In April of 1775, just days before the Battle of Lexington, he packed up his type, his press, his paper supply, and as he put it, stole it out of Boston. He took it to Worcester, a safe distance from the British troops stationed in Boston. The press, the type cases, and his imposing stone are still on view at the American Antiquarian Society, seen in place here in the reading room. In Worcester, Thomas continued to print patriotic rhetoric and descriptions of the Revolutionary War battles in the Massachusetts Spy. He continued to live and work in Worcester after the war, owning several printing presses and offices and bookstores, as well as paper mills and a bindery, employing over 150 people. Thomas published newspapers, broadsides, sheet music, periodicals, pamphlets, and a yearly almanac. He produced over 400 book titles for adult and juvenile readers. All of these materials became the basis for the AAS collections. In 1802, at the age of 53, Thomas retired to pursue his interests in the history of the young nation and the origins of printing. He produced The History of Printing, a publication which came out in 1810, which remains one of the seminal reference books on the subject. In 1812, 10 years after his retirement, Thomas founded the American Antiquarian Society. It was the high point of his long life as a printer, a publisher, and a book collector. At last, the patriot printer turned print historian had a permanent repository for his treasures and those of his friends and colleagues interested in America's antiquities. While the Society's early accession records included Indian arrowheads, pottery fragments, and other relics, most of the collection was made up of books, pamphlets, and newspapers, the earliest significant accessions given by Thomas himself. And this is an image of the first antiquarian hall in Worcester, which Thomas actually designed himself. Thomas must have been born with collector's genes. Even at a young age, he managed to save not one but 2 copies of broadsides he had printed, later proudly annotating them as his own work. One he folded carefully and docketed in the usual 18th century legal style. The other copy he eventually preserved, having it bound in a collection of pamphlets. In 1824, he gave the Society a personal treasure for the collection. He labeled it, or described it in the accession books as a printer's composing stick used by the donor when only 6 years of age in 1755. We still have that in our collections, and it was the device that he used to arrange the type before it was set for printing. Only a committed collector could have managed to save both the paper and the tool for 69 eventful years. True to a collector's interest in documenting the progress of library acquisition, Thomas's very first gifts to the Society were blank books in which to list future gifts. His successors used these notebooks aptly, and these precious volumes are still archived at the Society, which, after much growth, is now housed in its 3rd home in Worcester. We are actually just beginning a new construction project we can see a little bit of here in this notch of the building, where we're adding a new conservation lab to help preserve the materials, and a new HVAC system, which is much needed, and a new multi-purpose space for teaching, for uses for education. Thomas preserved the record of his own past, his trade, and his country's history as he progressed through his long career as a printer and a publisher. His personal library grew through accumulation, purchase, and trade. For the Society's library, he purchased books and manuscripts. He accepted materials from failed business associates and newspaper publishers throughout the United States. The newspaper collection he gave to the Society is still the largest and most comprehensive in the world for early American titles. Thomas recognized that it was important for his new library to reflect not only his political and literary world, but that of the common people as well. To that end, he specifically purchased cheap, popular pamphlets and broadside ballads and songs. And I just selected this one because it's called The Ode on the Comet. It was a song concerning a comet that was visible in New England in 1811. And you can see that it's a very crude cut, but it is one of many that Thomas collected. And otherwise, these things are very ephemeral and tend to be lost and thrown away, but we have a very nice collection of them, thanks to Thomas. He spent much of his time in 1812 preparing a list of books in his vast library. This is a general index indicating the scope of his collection. When he finished, it was 217 pages long. In explaining the need for such an institution as the AAS, Thomas wrote, quote, "We cannot obtain a knowledge of those who are to come after us, nor are we certain what will be the events of future times. As it is in our power, so it should be our duty to bestow on posterity that which they cannot give to us, but which they may enlarge and improve and transmit to those who shall succeed them." He was very forward in his thinking, clearly. He established the custom of electing publishers and collectors of printed materials to membership with the hope and expectation that they might consider leaving their collections to the society as well. It is not surprising that Thomas was a good friend of Paul Revere. He and Revere had much in common. Revere needs no introduction here, but I'll just give a brief overview to help show his similarities to Thomas. He was a craftsman by birth and training, a member of the economic class referred to as mechanics, inferior to the merchants and shop owners, lawyers, and clerics who were the leaders of colonial society. But he was an ambitious artisan, and through his success as a silversmith, engraver, and prominent mason, he established the status and social network to associate with influential men such as Joseph Warren, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock, who sought his assistance both as a messenger and artisan to serve the patriot cause. As a member of the Sons of Liberty, Revere was involved with most of the acts of resistance during the Revolution, as was Thomas. Both men were Bostonians, Masons, and Sons of Liberty. They were lifelong friends, though Revere was 14 years older than Thomas. In her discussion of Thomas's relationship to Revere, Esther Forbes, in her Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Revere, wrote, quote, "When Paul Revere met this extraordinary young man," referring to Thomas, "it may have been the first and last time he found anyone with an energy equal to his own," unquote. Both were of the artisan class who worked their way up to respected status. When Revere became a Freemason in 1760 at the age of 25, he joined the artisan-dominated St. Andrew's Lodge and later became the Grand Master of Massachusetts in 1794. Thomas joined the Order of Freemasons in Worcester in 1793. He was the first master of the Morning Star Lodge and became Grand Master of Massachusetts also in 1802. Given his desire and indeed his sincere duty to collect for posterity, it is not surprising that some of what is in the AS collections related to Revere was likely collected by Thomas. But the Revere collection as it exists today was largely due to this man, Clarence Brigham, and it took nearly 40 years to assemble. Brigham noted in the preface to his 1954 publication, Paul Revere's Engravings, quote, "The development of the American Antiquarian Society's collection of Paul Revere's engravings shows how any collection can be enriched by persistent search and acquisition over the years," unquote. Brigham assumed the role of director at the AAS in 1908. And while the society at that time did not own most of the metal-cut engravings, such as mastheads of newspapers and cuts made for almanacs and pamphlets, thanks to Thomas, it owned only 8 of Paul Revere's 72 copperplate engravings. Those images in the collection included only 2 separately issued engravings, the Landing of the Troops, 1768, and the Portrait of William Pitt. And this, just to give you a context for this, appears on a broadside, which I just have a snapshot of here in context. It's on a speech entitled "A Speech to the Right Honorable Earl of Chatham," with an imprint printed by Eads and Gill in 1771. 3 of the existing engravings when Brigham came on were published in books: The Plan of the Hemp Mill and 2 cuts in Thomas Church's The Entertaining History of King Philip's War in 1772, and also 3 of the 11 book plates attributed to Revere, and of course one of those was Isaiah Thomas's. So that's just an excuse to show you a lot of Revere images, actually. But now I want to move on to look in more detail at some images. So as I indicated, only one of those engravings, this is one of the few, but only one of those I've shown really might be considered a protest print, The Landing of the Troops, which is one of the largest and rarest of his prints. Revere reissued this print in 1770, just after the Boston Massacre and 2 years after the landing of the troops. In doing so, he wanted to portray a tyrannical government making war against its own people. In the inscription, Revere notes the insolence of the troops as they marched on Long Wharf. The town, with its many steeples and wharves, was made to look pious and industrious. The AAS copy had been in collections for decades, long before Brigham arrived, and he was unable to determine how it came into collections, but it's quite possible that it was given by Thomas. In fact, Revere had engraved yet another view of Boston and the ships of war in harbor for the frontispiece of the Royal American Magazine, which was published by Thomas in January of 1774. Brigham notes that the important large engravings, however, along with the numerous trade cards, Masonic engravings, and issues of colonial paper money were missing from the collection when he came on. In addition, none of the English engravings which Revere copied for American publication had been located. These Brigham acquired through voluminous correspondence with both English and American booksellers. From 1915 to 1954, Brigham relentlessly pursued Revere prints. As he later noted about the Revere collection in his published 50 Years of Collecting Americana for the Library of the American Antiquarian Society, quote, "The collection has been built up, not with the aid of any outstanding gifts, but merely the haphazard acceptance of everything that came our way and the occasional purchase of an unusual or very rare print," unquote. Let's now return to the Massacre prints and some of the other Revere prints that Brigham added to the collection. The Society did not even own a copy of the Boston Massacre when Brigham began his tenure at AAS, though it was known that a copy would be coming through a bequest. And indeed, a copy came from a bequest from Nathaniel Payne, who died in 1917, and interestingly, he was a relative of Dr. William Payne, who was a revolutionary loyalist from Worcester, for whom Revere had made a very elegant tea service in 1773, which is now at the Worcester Art Museum. There were, in fact, 3 prints of the massacre issued in Massachusetts in 1770 by 3 different engravers. The massacre took place on March 5, 1770. By March 26, the Boston Evening Post advertised that a print containing a representation of the late horrid massacre in King Street was available for sale by Eads and Gill. In his daybook, Revere charged Eads and Gill on March 28 for printing 200 impressions of the print. Another Boston engraver, Henry Pelham, was livid that Revere had in fact copied his print of the event. And this is Pelham's version here. In a letter to Revere dated March 29th, Pelham wrote, quote, "When I heard that you was cutting a plate of the late murder, I thought it impossible, as I knew you was not capable of doing it unless you copied it from mine, and as I thought I had entrusted it in the hands of a person who had more regard to the dictates of honor and justice than to take the undue advantage, as you have done, the confidence and trust I reposed in you. But I find I was mistaken, and after being at the great trouble of expense of making a design, paying for paper, printing, etc., find yourself in the most ungenerous manner deprived not only of any proposed advantage, but even of the expense I have had been at it, and as truly as if you had plundered me on the highway." Clearly he's very upset, mostly because of the expense he had gone to produce the print. And Revere had simply scooped him and gotten his out, copied Pelham's, and gotten it onto the market first. The print in question by Pelham is seen here and is only one of 2 known to exist. I think most of us would probably agree that Pelham is a better engraver, but certainly the one that is most familiar to us is Revere's because it is more popular and because it had a much wider distribution. The Boston newspaper on April 2nd, 1770, advertised Pelham's print, describing it, as he does, as the fruits of arbitrary power, and described it as, quote, "an original print taken on the spot." But even so, by the time Pelham's print reached the street, Revere's print had already flooded the market. The third engraving of the massacre in the same year is by Jonathan Mulligan of Newburyport. It's quite like Revere's version, and it seems likely that Mulligan, a clock and watchmaker from Newburyport, copied Revere's version to capitalize on the success of the image. There are about half a dozen copies of this print in collections, so there are not, a few more of these, but still a rare print. And some are colored. Ours happens not to be. The imagery of the Boston Massacre really did travel far and wide, and in some cases it was carried right onto the battlefield. This powder horn from the historic Deerfield collections shows, it's in reverse, but this is, I don't know how well you can see, but this is a version of the massacre shown in reverse on this powder horn by Jacob Gay, who is a well-known and very well-respected powder horn engraver made for Hamilton Davidson, and you can make out his name on here. And this, I think, is a great example. This was in 1772, so clearly Gay, the engraver, was copying this for his client so that he could have a copy to carry with him. We see this also on other powder horns, other versions, or other images by Revere. This is currency that Revere printed that also shows up on a powder horn in the historic Deerfield collections. Difficult for you to see, but it is in fact on this end of the powder horn the same image that has been engraved there. And we also know from Brigham's correspondence with William Goodwin of Hartford, Connecticut, who in the 1930s was working on a comprehensive list of all of the Revere massacre prints. He was planning to write a monograph on this subject, which didn't eventually happen, but he collected a lot of material and was in correspondence with Brigham a good deal. And he noted that an object came to his attention, which was a whale's tooth. That had the massacre engraved on the side of it. So it's, I think, wonderful to see the transfer of imagery from 2 to 3-dimensional form and to see how this sort of imagery moved from place to place in one form or another. Other forms of the image were printed in 1771 and 72. Isaiah Thomas published the Massachusetts Calendar, or the Almanac, for 72, which contained a woodcut of the massacre, which Brigham attributes to Revere. It's very much his style. And Thomas advertises in the Massachusetts Spy that copies of this almanac were to be published in October of 1771. The cut was also published in a 1772 broadside, which was entitled A Monumental Inscription on the 5th of March, together with a few lines on the enlargement or the imprisonment of Ebenezer Richardson, convicted of murder. This references the murder, the killing of an 11-year-old Christopher Sider, who was killed by the musket of a notorious Tory informer, Ebenezer Richardson, who was under threat from a mob in the February of 1770. His musket went off and killed Christopher Sider, and the broadside notes that Richardson, as of the 5th of March, 1772, remained unhanged. And so this image keeps reoccurring each year around March 5th in various forms to remind, as a form of protest, to remind of this ongoing presence and the resistance against the British. And that image is one that worked very effectively. Revere's image was also recycled during the abolitionist period. Chromolithograph in 1856 is seen here, which was printed by John Buford of Boston. It's based on a print by William Champney. And here, Crispus Attucks, right in the center, aggressively engages with the troops in the manner described in some of the historical accounts. His left hand is seizing the bayonet of the soldier's rifle, and his right is wielding a club. Here, Attucks is bold and defiant in the face of the British foes, and he's portrayed as a hero and as a patriot. Attucks was identified by black activists and abolitionists as the first patriot martyr of the Revolution. So we can see how these images get recirculated and reused for various causes. And as we know, Crispus Attucks was one of the 5 who was killed during the Boston Massacre. I want now to show some other Revere prints that might be considered protest prints. This is an early one from 1765. According to Brigham, there are only 4 known copies of this engraving. He acquired this one for the AAS collections in 1913 from the dealer Charles Goodspeed. The allegorical scene shows a dragon representing the Stamp Act, carrying a scroll labeled Magna Carta facing a group of 10 figures, 4 of whom are labeled U for the United Provinces, and this is going to be very difficult for you to see here, but all of these figures have letters identifying Virginia, New York, Rhode Island, B for Boston. He's identified the various participants, and on the ground under 2 bodies, are 2 bodies under the dragon's foot, which signs indicating their identity. At the right is a Liberty Tree with the date August 14th, 1765, commemorating the outbreak on that day when a crowd opposing the Stamp Act hanged an effigy of Andrew Oliver, the stamp master, and then demolished several houses. On the tree is a figure of John Husk, who was hanged in effigy on November 1st of 1765 in retaliation for his reported efforts to have the Stamp Act passed. Husk was a native of New Hampshire who had removed to England and was elected a member of the House of Commons, and his name is synonymous with the opposition to the colonies. So there's lots of symbolism going on here, lots of imagery that in the period people would certainly recognize. Sometimes it's hard for us looking back at these to sort of know who these people are or to identify, but in the period, quite recognizable. Now, Revere copied this plate from a volume of English political caricature titled The Scotch Scourge, which was published in 1763. It was issued to signal opposition to the Excise Bill in 1763. And in adapting his plate for American consumption, Revere omitted Lord Bute's group over here and substituted the Liberty Tree with the hanging of Husk. He copied the group opposing the dragon to include the figure of Britannia, and then he added 4 more figures to depict the United Provinces. So you can see, though this is difficult in light for you to get a sense of, but you can see how he's using the imagery from the previous print, but adding his own touches to it to make it appropriate for an American audience in the form of resistance. The relationship between Thomas and Revere is demonstrated yet again in their business interactions. Brigham notes that the plates that Revere made for the Royal American Magazine in 1774 to 75 constituted one of his most important undertakings in the field of engraving. Revere cut more plates in 1774 than in any other year. Thomas established the magazine in January of 74, aimed at a genteel literary audience. It had a wide circulation, about 1,000 copies, and that helped to spread Revere's name. Most of the engravings were copied from English originals, but then the text had largely been taken from London magazines as well. So although they were copied from English sources, Revere often added his own touches, and these images contributed to the rhetoric of the American Revolution. This example from June of 74 is called The Able Doctor, or America Swallowing the Bitter Drop. The cartoon shows Lord North with the Boston Port Bill extending from his pocket, forcing tea, represented by the intolerable axe, down the throat of this partially draped native female figure, which represents America. Her arms are restrained, and Lord Sandwich, who is a notorious womanizer, peeks up her skirt. Britannia, who is behind her, is turning away, shielding her face. And this is quite similar to an English version that Revere copied. In this case, really the main change he made was to add the words tea, T-E-A, to the teapot to make it quite clear what was going on here. Another example is this one, America in Distress. This is from the March issue of the American Royal Magazine in 1775. This was the final issue, and this is the frontispiece. And this too was copied from an English plate, which happened to be labeled Britannia in Distress. And again, Revere has copied it quite closely, but he mainly has changed for Britannia, and I don't have example of the English print, but note that he's got this bow and arrow and the Indian headdress, which he is used to represent America. In the English version, Britannia has a shield. Now, much has been made of Revere's copying in the prints of others, which was actually a widespread practice of the period, but I'd like to complicate that narrative just a bit. We've already seen how in many cases Revere adds or changes the image to suit the political climate. By looking at a few more of his Revolutionary era prints from a variety of genres in more detail, we can see how images and the ideas associated with them circulated throughout the body politic. When Revere engraved a bill of credit for the colony of Massachusetts Bay in July of 1775, he adorned the note with what Clarence Brigham describes as an elaborate rectangular design with a codfish at the top and a rather crude figure of a patriot holding in his right hand a staff surmounted by a liberty cap. That's Brigham's description. Now, Brigham's study of Revere's engravings remains the Bible for Revere's works on paper, but in this case, I think he misinterprets the image. The Revere figure, or the figure that Revere had engraved, crude though it may have been, was not a representation of a colonial patriot, but rather a Native American, not the naked Indian of the 1629 Massachusetts Bay Colony seal, but a robed Indian standing in a contrapposto pose. The printed text at the top of the note, borrowed and received of for the use and service of the colony of the Massachusetts Bay, indicates the function of the promissory note, but the text seems ironic in light of the backstory of the Indian image used to illustrate the note. It gives us some insight into the circulation of imagery and ideas circulating around and concerning race and empire and dissent in the Revolutionary era. It shows how Native Americans were portrayed in visual culture for political and financial gain by those who felt oppressed by British rule. I'll use just a few of Revere's prints to help illustrate the complexities of imagery during the Revolutionary period. When Boston celebrated the repeal of the Stamp Act on May 24, 1766, the Sons of Liberty erected a temporary wooden obelisk covered with oiled paper and illustrated with allegorical scenes of leading actors of the Stamp Act crisis. One observer noted that on the common there was, quote, an obelisk very beautifully decorated and with very grand fireworks displayed. Illuminated with 280 burning lamps and crowned by a box of fireworks to go off at the climax of the celebration, the obelisk was ultimately consumed by flame. Revere's engraving of the obelisk, seen here, was made before the final arrangements for the celebration were made, and so it exists as the only visual evidence of the ill-fated structure. This is one of Revere's rarest and probably most original engravings. The AAS copy was bequeathed to the Society in 1927. The imagery includes 12 portraits of Englishmen around the top, considered friends of the colonies, including William Pitt, whom we saw earlier, who I believe is here. And here Revere employs a version of the naked Indian from the Massachusetts seal. In this case, what had become for printmakers a mythic stereotype, a female warrior in the familiar skirt of leaves and feathered headdress, representing colonial repression, similar to the Able Doctor print that we saw. In the final vignette, Revere portrays both the female Indian warrior as America and the figure of liberty standing on either side of Britannia in what might be seen as an uneasy mother-daughter relationship. 2 years later, in his satirical print Warm Place Hell, from 1768, Revere lampoons the 17 rescinders of the circular letter put forth by the Massachusetts House of Representatives that opposed the levying of taxes on the colonies by Parliament. This also came to the Society by bequest in 1927. I believe there are only 2 copies known, the other at the John Carter Brown Library. Revere borrows again from the print source in the Scotch Scourge, but in his version, he increases the number of figures to 17. He adds a flying devil above and adds to the upper right corner a familiar figure to all Bostonians. This is the print, the English print that he was using as the prototype. Revere chose to place the representation of the Indian weather vane with bow and arrow atop the cupola of the Province House of Boston. In 1716, the Province House became the residence of the royal governors of the province of Massachusetts Bay, and at about that time, Shem Drown, Boston's most noted tin plate worker, created the hammered and gilded copper weather vane. This is at the Massachusetts Historical Society now, as many of you know. Drown probably drew inspiration for his figure from the 1629 symbol of the colony, though the Indian has taken a more active stance in a three-dimensional form with bow drawn and aimed at the rescinders. Serving as a lookout for the city from its elevated location on the Province House by pointing into the direction of the wind as it carried out its function, the weather vane would have been familiar to all of Boston's residents, whether literate or not. By including this symbolic and visually prominent landmark in his satirical print of the rescinders heading into the jaws of hell, Revere gives viewers no doubt as to the local political import of the print's subject. The addition of the familiar Indian archer weather vane atop the Province House provided the symbolic sense of the collective struggle Revere was seeking. In the obelisk and the warm place hell prints, Revere appropriated Indian identity based on the stereotyped example from the Massachusetts seal to help advance the cause of the colony in its own struggle against tyranny. The figure in Revere's aforementioned 1775 Bill of Credit is not the naked Indian of these earlier prints, but is clothed and holds not the bow and arrow, but a staff or long wand, an ancient Roman emblem known as the Vindicta, mounted by a liberty cap, or the pileus. These symbols of emancipation were familiar throughout the early modern Europe in the 18th century, but the imagery received renewed interest after the German archaeologist Johann Joachim Winckelmann discovered a bas-relief with a representation of liberty in Roman excavations and then published its description in 1766. On both sides of the Atlantic, paintings and political cartoons portrayed liberty as the Roman goddess Libertas, dressed in a long garment and cloak, holding a wand and cap, symbolizing the freeing of Roman slaves from bondage through the ritual of touching them with a wand and handing them the token of a soft cap to cover their shaved heads. Certainly, Revere had also employed the use of the Liberty Goddess as political symbol in engravings from political cartoons, as we saw in the obelisk print, to masthead designs for the Massachusetts Spy in 71 and 74, to his likenesses of John Hancock and Samuel Adams for the Royal American Magazine in the spring of 74. The figure on the promissory note bears liberty symbols, but the body is male and wears a long belted shirt open at the neck, moccasins, and a mantle over his shoulders. The image bears resemblance to one that Revere had employed 3 years earlier in the 1772 edition of Thomas Church's The Entertaining History of King Philip's War, first published in 1716 by Thomas's father, Benjamin Church. Revere had been asked to engrave a representation of King Philip, a frontispiece lacking in the first edition. Brigham dismisses Revere's portrait of King Philip as, quote, a grotesque effigy of what Revere supposed the celebrated Indian chief looked like. In fact, we now know that Revere did not merely invent his representation of King Philip. Bradford Swan details in a 1959 pamphlet entitled An Indians in Indian, or the Several Sources of Paul Revere's Engraved Portrait of King Philip, that Revere based his portrait of Metacomet on the mezzotint prints of 2 of the 4 kings of Canada by John Simon, which in turn were based on the paintings by the Dutch portrait artist residing in London, John Verhelst. I hope you're still with me. We're circulating about, these images get used in so many ways. The prints represented the 4 Mohawk sachems who visited London in 1710 in search of a plan by the North American colonists to convince Queen Anne to support a second military expedition against the French and their native allies at Montreal, the capital of New France. The 4 had been declared visiting royals and were treated as such over the course of several weeks' visit. Their kingly status was largely a fiction imposed on the men as part of the scheme to further the crown's imperial agenda in North America. Nevertheless, they were shown great ceremony and feted at the court of Queen Anne, who ordered that their portraits be made by Verrilist. Swan observes that Revere took the portrait of Honi Yi Ta No Ro on the left and substituted the bow in his left hand, and for the bow in his left hand, the gun and forearm from the portrait of Sanayit Quinu Pipo, which is right here, and reversed it. Swan notes in an essay called The Prince of the American Indian that Revere had borrowed shamelessly from the mezzotints. But how might Revere have known to borrow shamelessly from them? Kevin Miller has demonstrated how these portraits function in a transatlantic context soon after their production. In 1712, just 2 years after the visit to London, the Reverend William Andrews, an Anglican minister sent by the Society for the Propagation for the Gospel, traveled from London with 194 sets of the Simon mezzotints for distribution among the colonies and Native Americans. One set of the framed prints went to the Boston Council chambers, in addition to 8 unframed sets that were delivered to Boston. The framed prints at the Boston Town House or State House, where the workings of the colonial government occurred, would have reminded the Council and Assembly of their duty to uphold the alliance with the Iroquois as affirmed by the Queen. Given Revere's active role during the Revolution, he could easily have seen the framed prints in the State House, or just as likely in print shops decades after their distribution in Boston. In his discussion of Revere's use of the Simon prints, Swan states that it is a widely known fact that Revere was notorious for using the work of others, making his own copies for his purposes. He also notes that he seldom used his imagination in his engravings. It seems likely that Revere would look to the 4 Indian king portraits when undertaking an illustration of an Indian king. He was drawing on a familiar story and its imagery to make his print read successfully as King Philip. Numerous accounts of the story of the 4 Indian kings were published soon after their visit to London and continued throughout the 18th century and into the 19th century on both sides of the Atlantic. The ballad in broadside form was the most widely published. The only surviving copy of a 1762 cheap broadside ballad in the AAS collection is presumed to have been printed by Zachariah Fowle. If you remember, he was the person that Isaiah Thomas was apprenticed to. The AAS version originally had 2 woodcuts at the top here that were cut off, but the image portrayed one of the 4 kings in a stance derived from the Simon prints. To return to Revere's appropriation of the 4 kings' portraits in the guise of King Philip, I want to draw attention to his accoutrements. Despite the clear similarity in stance of Revere's Philip to the Verrilist Simon kings, it's clear that Revere makes Metacomet's dress conform specifically to Church's text regarding the killing of Philip in 1676. In the text, there is a description of everything that Revere is wearing, including the wampum belt, the hat, the star. All of this is quite clearly described in the text, and Revere was reading that and using that in his illustration. Revere's rendering of the figure on the promissory note is without these accoutrements, particularly to King Philip, but the figure stance is unmistakably similar. For this version, however, he has returned to the posture of Sagayit Kwapito, with a raised arm on his right, replacing the gun with the liberty staff and cap. The figure's dress, however, conforms to that of Hoyin Yi Tano Ro. The added words, American paper, on the promissory note reinforce American intent in seeking independence from Britain. During the summer of 1775, when he was printing the bills of credit and currency for the colony, Revere was among the many refugees in Watertown, Mass. During the British occupation of Boston. He had smuggled out of Boston his tools, his press, his copperplate for engraving. Both copper and paper were very difficult to acquire, but he managed to print everything from 6-shilling to 4-pound notes during this trying time. Most art historians would agree that Revere was not a great engraver of prints. When compared with the work of his contemporaries, Revere's engravings seem clumsy and even somewhat amateur in their execution. His skill with engraving tools is much more evident in his silver work and the designs he wrought on 3-dimensional objects. but he was successful in communicating visually the message he wished to communicate through printed imagery by using familiar tropes. Rather than simply accusing Revere of looking for something to copy in turning to Symonds prints for his representation of Metacom, I suggest we consider Revere's copying as something more akin to what William Hunting Howell describes as the arts of dependence, imitation, emulation, methods of production that can be valuable, as valuable, or possibly even more valuable than the original. Dependence, as Howell uses it, is not helplessness, nor does it suggest a lack of imagination or creativity, but rather a familiarity and acknowledgement of connection. Understood in this way, Revere's borrowing from the Four Kings prints for his rendering of King Philip can be seen as a pictorial strategy, the use of visual trope that acknowledged the power of Native American sovereigns as individuals to reckon with through negotiation or through war. Similarly, Revere's derivation of the Four Kings imagery for the Bill of Credit 3 years after his rendering of Philip may be reviewed as Revere's way of quoting this visual language to communicate the sovereignty of America, supported by the symbols of liberty and freedom during the War for Independence. Revere's image on the Massachusetts promissory note ensured the continued circulation of the Four Kings based on Verrillis portraits, but some 65 years later, the borrowed image was much simplified and adapted for a colonial American audience in the midst of revolution. Originally commissioned by Queen Anne, the image of Revere's hand underwent a transformation, first to portray the sachem King Philip, and then to portray a male version of Libertas as America, the gun replaced by staff and liberty cap. This imagery served Revere's purpose in the summer of 1775, giving the printed note currency by visually spreading the message of sovereignty and independence as the colony sought self-government, but also earning him a much-needed income, turning out 1,000 impressions of the note. Using these examples from Revere's body of work, we begin to get a better sense of how he operated and conducted business in a tumultuous time. He may have been playing with imagery and symbols to promote the revolutionary cause, a form of dissent that was about sending messages of freedom and liberty, or he may have been producing simply as fast and efficiently as possible in order to survive. Either way, it is the breadth and collections at AAS, suggested here by what we refer to as the generous dome in our reading room, that is based on a collecting strategy initiated by Isaiah Thomas in 1812 and perpetuated by directors that followed him. Clarence Brigham understood the need and indeed had the drive to collect the full range of Revere's works. He continued Thomas's philosophy that though we don't know what the events of the future may be, quote, it should be our duty to bestow on posterity that which may enlarge and improve and transmit to those who shall succeed them. Thank you very much.
Besides, you mentioned Revere and Pelham. Approximately how many copperplate engravers would have been working in Boston in the 1770s? And also, if you know approximately how many wood engravers would there have been? Because I know that Revere seemed to work in both copper and wood.
Yes, there were certainly other engravers who were working in the period. It's hard to know precisely how many. They came and went. Revere is one of those who is successful and kept at it for a good period of time. Nathaniel Hurd is another, I would say, better engraver, and worked long enough to be, have produced enough that we know his work as well. And interestingly, Hurd was also a silversmith, so there is a similarity there, and that's it's artisans tended to do whatever they could to survive, and I think in Revere's case he was much, as I indicated, much better, much more successful as an artisan or as an artist in his silver work, less so in his prints, but it was a vehicle for him, and it also was a form of income, and the same would be true for Hurd. I don't know that I can give you a number of how many. I mean, there were, maybe half a dozen, but then they were coming and going. And also, there were engravers who worked in both forms. Now, Some of the images that I showed you were in fact what we described as woodcuts, even though technically they were cut in metal. They just weren't copper engravings. That is, they weren't intaglio, which is inscribing into copper to get a print. Woodcuts is a term for a relief cut, which is what Revere was using, mostly lead, sometimes brass, and those are the ones that you were seeing in the mastheads. So engravers could do both, and again, it sort of depends on what the need is and the availability of materials. It's a great question, and it helps to put into context what was happening during the period, because we know a lot about Revere because he's Paul Revere. And there are a lot of artisans that we know nothing about because we don't have that record. And it's because of Revere's notoriety that his prints and materials related to him were saved. And the great thing about that is it gives us a better sense of how artisans in the period functioned. You need a complete archive or as complete as possible to help tell that story.
Thank you. Nan, I don't want to get too far ahead of us, but can you give us a quick overview of what your future exhibit will be featuring?
Yeah, so the exhibition is focused on Revere as an artisan, not so much about his role as a writer in the Midnight Rite. I mean, that certainly is an important part of the story, but we really want to focus on his role as an artisan, how the challenges of functioning during this period as an artisan, and show the full range of his work. His works on paper, but also his silver. He worked in many forms of metal, and to show his work in cannons and bells. The sort of theme that holds all of his work together is his ability to work in metals and work from one to the other. He sort of transferred that knowledge. He was really kind of a genius with metals and figured that out. And he was very, I think, very experimental and wanted to continue to learn and to try out new things. And once he was successful at something, he tended to move on to something else. He might pass it on to one of his sons and then move on. He was the one who really wanted to keep producing in various forms of media, and it's in the metals that he was most successful. So the exhibition, which will open in 2019, is intended to show that range of work that he produced and to get a sense of what it was like to work during the period, to show where he was getting his materials, who was working for him, what was the labor involved, where were the materials coming from, what was the labor involved in getting those materials, to try to tell the full story of his production. It will be a traveling exhibition that will open at the Worcester Art Museum. It will travel to the New York Historical Society and perhaps to additional venues from 2019 to 2020.
Thank you again, Nan Wolverton.
Thank you all.
Please give her a round of applause. Thank you.